Russia has the world's most significant nuclear capability. Russia's nuclear capability is predominantly land-based. Both Russia and the United States maintain the so-called triad, so they have nuclear weapons and delivery systems across the three military domains of land, sea and air. Russia is more of a land-based. It's the world's principal land-based nuclear power. Well, it's not just a coincidence that numerically Russia has more nuclear weapons than anybody else. Land-based missiles are potentially vulnerable to preemptive first strike because they're fixed. It's easier to find out where they are and they're more difficult to move. So we guard against that, the threat of preemptive, a disarming first strike in the jargon, by having basically so many of them. The US could take out 90% of Russia's land-based intercontinental ballistic missile capability. And Russia could launch the remaining 10%, and then the US could, through its ballistic missile defense technologies, eliminate half of that. But 5% of Russia's strategic nuclear inventory landing on US population centers is something that is still absolutely unthinkable. That's the essence of deterrence. And that, in a nutshell, simply put, is the essence of Russian nuclear thinking. It means, number one, that Russia itself can never be directly attacked by any other state, including the United States, NATO, or China. Do you need this complex and sophisticated mix of enough on the land, enough in the air, and then enough under the sea as well, which is the basis of US nuclear planning and strategy? I don't think you do, because I think nuclear deterrence works just as well from the Russian perspective as it does from the US perspective. And I think we can see that very clearly in the Ukraine context. Now, nobody that I'm aware of, certainly not in the public domain, amongst Western governments, is even remotely seriously contemplating escalating support for Ukraine to a level where there's even the remote possibility of any kind of Russian nuclear use and Russian nuclear response. So Russia has got more than enough to deter, is the bottom line. My name is Dr. Martin Smith, and I'm a lecturer at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. This is Russia's true power. Russia doesn't really have a significant blue water naval capability, i.e. no way can the Russian Navy establish and sustain a global maritime presence in any way comparable to what the United States is currently doing, and what China perhaps increasingly aspires to begin to do. So I think amongst those big three, in military terms, in the maritime domain, Russia is, relatively speaking, the poor relation. It's the least powerful of the three main branches of the Russian armed forces. It's been relatively neglected compared to the Air Force and the Army. So you hear these stories about the Admiral Kuznetsov, for example, Russia's aircraft carrier. When it undertakes a significant deployment, it has to have basically a couple of support ships exclusively carrying spare parts because it breaks down so frequently. And the very fact that, compared to the United States, which currently has 11 fully equipped carrier battle groups, so aircraft carriers and appropriate supporting vessels. At the moment, the Russian Navy has just the one. China has two and is in the process of building a third, as I understand it. I think traditionally, Russia is a land power, just because of its, well, for two reasons, because of its sheer size and its mass, which is, in power terms, you could argue is both an asset and a vulnerability. It's vulnerability because it has literally thousands of miles of borders in the east and in the west, bordering European countries as well. Historically, the great concern of Russian leaders and military planners has been the perception of vulnerability from the West. So the emphasis traditionally, and this is not just sort of military planning, this arguably has seeped into sort of Russian cultural views about its vulnerability and its what is needed to defend itself and to preserve Russia as a viable state and society. You need a strong mass army. So even if you're facing states and armies which may technologically be more sophisticated than you are, you can ultimately, and it might be brutal, it might be bloody, it might be grinding, but eventually, due to mass, due to the assistance from General Winter, the Russian Winter, and due to the sheer size of the country, you will beat them back and you will prevail. But to do that, you need a mass army, not just a mass deployable, mobilizable army, but you need essentially infinite reserves that you can throw into the fight if necessary. Russia is one of the world's principal military spenders. Its annual defence budget is consistently in the top 10 of global military spending. It's also a significant arms exporter, not least to China. So measured on that basis, Russia, in quantitative hard power terms, Russia is, globally speaking, one of the world's most significant hard powers. It varies because levels of defence spending vary, but roughly around the 5th or 6th largest defence spender in the world. The United States is consistently, by some distance, the world's largest. I think there's technology, the SU range of aircraft, that are comparable in quality. I wouldn't go as far as to say that they leave the US in the shade and US military developers and technicians wish that they had something like that. But they're certainly considered to be on a par, as are some of the more modern Russian tanks as well. So I think the issue with the Russian weaponry is not its lack of technological sophistication and quality, but the relatively ineffective use to which it's been put. I would say that this has been arguably Mr. Putin's greatest achievement. Let me try and justify that. When he took over, very last day of the old millennium, so December 31st, 1999, when he was basically appointed president by Boris Yeltsin, he issued basically a manifesto, we would call a manifesto, so a core statement of his beliefs about what was wrong with Russia at that time and what was required in order to bring Russia back. And so Mr. Putin's basic argument in 1999 is the only way to get the show back on the road and to hold this thing together is by reconstituting, that's an important point, reconstituting a strong, centralised state authority. So what we, and of course the word we often use in the West is authoritarian regime, which to us, from our perspective, that's what Mr. Putin's system of governance looks like. Without seeking to justify that in any way, the point I would make is it's been effective. It has brought Russia back. It has provided, if you compare Russia today, in terms of the internal and domestic picture, with Russia for most of the 1990s, before Mr. Putin came to power, then it is far stronger, more cohesive, and more effective. And the government, and this surprises many Westerners as well, has enjoyed durable popularity. Internationally, does the Putin system have any real soft power clout? No, I would say. But domestically, I think substantially and durably so. The essence of Russia's hard power are its hydrocarbon exports. The fact that it is one of the most significant, in fact the most significant exporter of gas in the world, and has amongst the most significant reserves of oil and gas as well. So as long as those are absolutely pivotal to the global economy, that is going to be a solid core revenue generator for the Russian government to be able to spend, well, as it sees fit, but to spend a significant percentage of that on maintaining its military, its conventional and its nuclear capability. So as long as that stays the case, then Russia possesses core economic strength. If that progressively ceases to be the case, or if there is a significant global shift away from dependence on hydrocarbons in favour of dependence on renewables, then that could be bad news for Russia's economic base. And because this is the base of Russia's hard power per se, that would be bad news for Russia's hard power. The impact of that is going to be measured in years, perhaps decades, rather than the months. So for the foreseeable future, Russia's hard power base, as I see it, is going to remain substantially intact. What is Russia's rightful role in the Putinist view? Two things. It's a great power, which means that it is a globally significant player. Not the only one, but one of the leading global power centres. And so the other core element of Putinism has been this stress on what's called multipolarity. In a multipolar world order, there are three or more globally significant power centres. The great bugbear for Mr. Putin and his supporters is the American scheme to maintain a unipolar world order, i.e. a world order centred around the status of the United States as top dog. It's not that Russia wants to be top dog, it wants to create a unipolar Russian world, but it's opposed to unipolarity per se. Russia is rightfully a leading power centre and expects to be regarded as such and expects to be treated as such by the United States and others. When it doesn't feel it's being treated that way, that's when there have been problems, in Mr. Putin's view. The big one, in terms of structural power, traditionally, for Soviet and Russian governments was the United Nations, because since 1945 the Soviet Union / Russia has had the built-in institutional role of being one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council with the right of veto. Russian leaders, up to and including Mr. Putin, have always stressed the pivotal role that the United Nations should play as the preeminent global security institution. So essentially, big decisions pertaining to international peace and security should not be taken and actioned other than through the UN. Anything else is illegal and illegitimate. So to that extent, Russian leaders have also traditionally consistently stressed the importance of international law, particularly when it comes to the use of armed force. One of the significant things, and I think I'm surprised this hasn't garnered more attention so far, is the extent to which Mr. Putin has seriously undermined traditional Russian claims about the supremacy of the United Nations and international law. Article 2, paragraph 4 of the UN Charter quite clearly says that it is illegal for any state to use or to threaten to use armed force against the sovereignty, territory, or independence of any other state. For any reason. There's no, read further on, and there's 2 or 3 get-outs, that is a blanket prohibition. Does this tell us, potentially, something about Russian views of the diminishing utility of structural power? If Russian leaders previously felt the need to refer regularly to the UN international law, remind people of Russia's core status on the Security Council, and it was the Westerners who were illegally intervening in places like Kosovo or Iraq, who were weakening that. Now it's Russia itself which is illegally intervening and not even trying to dress it up within any sort of legal justificatory framework. Does this mean that Mr. Putin has, if you like, gone beyond the point of no return and accepted, okay, Russia's status at the UN may well never recover from this because it's been so flagrant, but actually we don't care. And that would be, it seems to me, quite a significant departure for a Russian leader, if that indeed proves to be the case. You need a big resource base in order to sustain yourself as a power. That's not enough in itself. It's not a guarantee because it depends on how you use those resources, etc., etc. But you need to have a significant resource base. And if you look at the great powers in the world today, the United States, China, India, perhaps sort of coming up on the rails. Brazil in the Latin American context, what do they all have in common? They are geographically big countries with relatively large populations. Great powers are big powers, and therefore being by landmass the biggest country in the world, that in itself is enough at a basic level to make people sit up and take notice. It's unique because it has borders on the one side with China, and on the other side with members of NATO and the European Union. That gives Russia the basis for claiming to be involved and claiming we have a right to a say here. We are an Asian power. We have a 1,000-kilometre plus border with China. That makes us an Asian power. Just as Russia has a western borders, as you say, with a number of members of NATO and the European Union. So Russia is a leading factor in the European security equation. The main cons are having so many, such extensive land borders with so many different states that presents perpetual vulnerabilities. So at the moment, Russian relations with China are pretty good. That hasn't always been the case. That might not always be the case in the future. They came to blow the late 1960s, the USSR and Maoist China actually came to blows militarily. Not through fighting a major war, but there were military exchanges amongst the disputed border. To this day, the Russo-Chinese border remains the longest undemarcated border in the world. They haven't finally and definitively agreed where the borderline should be drawn. So there's always the potential for relations to worsen as a result of border. So size is at one and the same time in power terms both an asset but also a source of enduring vulnerability. Russia's overseas military footprint is small. It's not non-existent, but it's small compared to the United States. But then again, compared to the United States, every other country in the world has a small overseas military footprint. China, for example, currently only has one overseas military base in Djibouti. Russia has about 8 at the moment, mainly in countries adjacent to itself, so other former Soviet states, such as Georgia, for example, the so-called, many Russians have referred to as the near abroad countries, and a couple in Syria as well. So it has a small, limited footprint, but I think from the Russian perspective, it's important. I think there is a substantial basis for arguing that, depending on how you understand the concept of ally, Russia actually doesn't have any allies. That doesn't mean there aren't states with which Russia has, important states with which Russia has friendly relations which have been identified as relations of partnership. China is the principal one. Officially, Russia and China have a strategic partnership, in inverted commas. So it has friendly relations. It has what we in the West would refer to and do refer to as client states, such as Belarus, but it doesn't have allies. What's an ally? Well, an ally, in terms of modern diplomatic usage, is a term that's used to describe the arrangements amongst NATO member states. Ultimately, a NATO ally is a state to which other NATO members are contractually obliged to assist if it's attacked by a non-member state. So the ultimate commitment, that's what the essence of alliance is. There's no other state in the world which has signed an agreement saying if Russia is attacked, we will regard that as being tantamount to an attack on our own sovereignty, our own territory, and we will act on that basis. And conversely, of course, it works both ways. Russia hasn't given that kind of commitment to any other state. So What it means, and I think you can see what it means in practice in the Ukraine context. There was a lot of assumptions were made in the West, and I suspect also in Russia, that at the very least, Belarus would be committing troops on the ground in Ukraine in support of the Russian special military operation since February. That has not happened. The Belarusian government, yes, rhetorical support, and I think there have been some training of Russian troops and opportunities for rest and recuperation of Russian forces being rotated out of Ukraine. But in terms of putting their own blood and treasure on the line in support of Russia in Ukraine, even the state which you might regard, if there's one exception to the rule I've just outlined for you there, it might be Belarus. You might say, well, Belarus is, to all intents and purposes, a Russian ally, but is it? Because it hasn't actually, in any significant way, at the risk of any significant cost to itself, it's not actually stepped up to help its ally out in a neighbouring state, because of course Belarus shares a border with Ukraine, as does Russia. It's always a challenging one because it's intangible and it's linked to those other great military intangibles, morale. But you've got plenty of stories of Russian troops in Ukraine being reluctant to fight, stories of desertion, occasional stories of their turning on their own commanders, giving themselves up, selling tanks to the Ukrainian army for a few $1,000s, all of these stories. But I think the most significant is how many of the Russian troops who were sent to Ukraine were not told where they were going, at least why they were going there. They were told they were going on an exercise close to the border of Ukraine, or they were going into Ukraine as part of the exercise, having been invited by fraternal Russian leaders. They weren't actually told that they were taking part in a war against another sovereign state and its government. The will to fight on the Ukrainian side has completely surprised both the Russian political elite and Russian military commanders. And also, I would suggest, it has surprised a lot of people in the West as well. Russian power is overly monodimensional. There's too much emphasis on the hard. The famous quote from Barack Obama after the first Russian intervention in Crimea and the Donbass in 2014, when people, I think, asked this sort of question.
Russia is a regional power that is threatening some of its immediate neighbors, not out of strength, but out of weakness.
So by saying Russia is merely a regional power, what he was quite clearly saying to those in the know, if you like, is Mr. Putin's claims about great power status for Russia just don't add up, just don't stack up. It doesn't have what it takes across the domain of power capabilities.